Welcome back to the Twinspires Racing Roundtable. I'm Ashley Anderson here with James Scully and Vance Hansen. The gang's all here. It's been a while since all three of us have been on the roundtable together. And we have a lot to cover today. It's Saratoga, Del Mar, and Ellis Park, where I was on assignment this past weekend for Kentucky Downs Preview Weekend. But let's start with Saratoga, where Arthur's Ride went gate to wire in the Grade 1 Whitney, now has earned a berth to the Breeders' Cup Classic. So Vance, is he the horse to beat in the Classic?
He looks like it to me. The Whitney has been kind of a harbinger of future success in the Breeders' Cup Classic in recent years. Of course, last year, White Barrio kind of had a breakout performance in the Whitney before going on to win the Breeders' Cup Classic. Before him, you had Nick's Go, McKinsey, and Improbable both won the Whitney, went on to run second in the Breeders' Cup Classic, and then Gunrunner, of course, started off this streak back in 2017. So, I think Arthur's Ride to me looks like a horse capable of following in the steps of White Barrio and Nick's Go, who won both of those races. And unlike some of the horses that were pegged as division leaders earlier this season, like National Treasure, who didn't show up in the mud at Saratoga on Saturday, and Senor Buscador, Arthur's Ride truly looks like a mile and a quarter type horse. Bill Mott said after the race he was kind of using this race as a prep, in quotations, for the Jockey Club Gold Cup at the end of the Saratoga meet, and he still intends on running Arthur's Ride in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. And I think that race is going to have one of its most significant renewals in a number of years. He's going to be joined by Kingsbarn. Tappa Trice, I think, is going to be aimed for that race, and perhaps the marathon legend in next could be dropping back in distance for the Gold Cup. So I think whoever wins that race might be the early Classic favorite, as the 3-year-old class, I think, still lacks a true mile and a quarter standout. So long-winded way of saying yes, I think Arthur's Ride looks like the horse to beat in the Classic right now, James.
Well, those are all fair points, and I definitely think that Arthur's Ride, I mean, his upward trajectory in this division has to be taken note of. I mean, he's running not only he was coming off a 12-plus length allowance within a mile and a quarter distance. The Whitney was his first stakes start, and in those last two races, he's earned Bristnet speed ratings of 107 and 107 for the Whitney. I don't have that. 106 two starts back. So 106, 107. Those put him on par with any horse in America that's pointing for the Breeders' Cup Classic right now. But one thing I will say is that, this race had a lot of people thought National Treasure was going to be the one to catch. I mean, he was odds on. I heard multiple people predicting he would make the lead. He'd be setting the pace. He'd be the one to catch. We saw there at the break of the Whitney, Skippy Longstocking definitely was eager and was being ridden hard for the front. And by the time they got to the first turn, Arthur's Ride was in front of them all, and he was clear, and he had everything his own way over a muddy track. So that's my only hesitation. I see a horse run a huge race, especially the first stakes appearance over a muddy track. I just want them to back it up on a fast track. But with that being said, he obviously has a lot going for him, like Vance referenced. There's no proven horses at the mile and a quarter distance, or at least top class proven horses at the mile and a quarter distance. The older horse division lacks seemingly quality and depth for the 10 furlong Breeders' Cup Classic distance. And, Arthur's Ride is going to come back in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. And if he carries his form forward, then, yeah, he'll absolutely establish himself as the one to beat in the Breeders' Cup Classic, at least among the older horses, Ashley.
I'm with you in not being completely sold yet that he's the horse to beat, especially with National Treasure tending to not do well on and off track. But I do certainly think the last two starts have been impressive. He already did prove himself at a mile and a quarter, two back with that massive win that you already mentioned, James. So we'll see what happens with the pace scenario when he faces potentially Dornoch and Fierceness. And then, of course, Sierra Leone could have the perfect setup as well as a closer in the Breeders' Cup Classic if he were to race in that as well. So I don't know if I'll say he's the horse to beat until I see him come back and race if we see him in the Jockey Club Gold Cup.
I will say about National Treasure, that's a fair point. He had run two previous races on off tracks. He was unplaced in both efforts. So that track was could worry. But, to me, he still is lacking. I mean, he ran second last year, National Treasure did, to Cody's Wish in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. And this year, they're obviously angling it to stretch him out to a mile and a quarter. But to me, for him to win at a mile and a quarter and maybe even a mile and an eighth, he has to get the right trip on the front end. A horse like Arthur's Ride that has all this speed, I think works against a horse like National Treasure at longer distances. So it's a little bit of a unenviable situation when you have these horses that you feel like are 100% classic horses, and then you start worrying that the distance is too far and they might be better suited to the dirt mile. So we'll see what happens next time in his final prep. I would think they'll run National Treasure one more time, and he could bounce back on a fast track at a distance of 9 furlongs or less. But ultimately, I see him in the same vein as First Mission and a whole bunch of these other horses where they have to have everything go their way to win Grade 1 races at like 9 furlongs or farther.
Well, in addition to the Whitney, we had the Grade 1 test at Saratoga and the Clement L. Hirsch at Del Mar. So, James, what were your takeaways from the other Grade 1 action?
Well, I'll mention Adair Manor. Adair Manor last season, she strung together 5 straight wins, including 4 straight graded wins. Before coming to the Breeders' Cup Distaff, she was dead on the board, went off about 5-1, and ran a non-threatening 7th. So even though she was dominating this distaff division on the West Coast last season, she wasn't a match for the challengers from the East Coast and Midwest she faced in the Breeders' Cup. This year could be a completely different story at Del Mar. Now, off of that Breeders' Cup distaff, Adair Manor came back this year in the Beholder Mile in early March. And she actually lost that race to Sweet Azteca. And I just thought it was going to be more of the same from her this season, where she would be able to beat up on suspect company, but she really wasn't that good. And I was wrong at that time, because her next start after the Beholder Mile was in the Apple Blossom. And she was dominant that day. She shipped to Oaklawn Park, and she just crushed them. And I came away just saying, wow, then at the time. And the Clement Hirsch just solidified my opinion, because unlike most of these races that she's been running in Southern California the past 2 seasons, that race had Scylla, who was shipping in off of a victory in the La Troyenne and has a lot going for her for Belmont, seemingly. Had Pretty Mischievous from the East Coast as well. It was just a better field that she's typically been facing. And I'll say one other thing. She usually gets these favorable up-close pace-pressing trips. She got caught behind Robles, had to settle, wait for her cue, and when she got it, she just blistered them. She won as much the best. She's faster this year. And, to me, she's the horse to breed in the Breeders' Cup Distaff, Vance.
Yeah, Adair Manor performed like a 3-5 favorite should after looking a little bit in danger when Scylla looked to be going very well loose on the lead at the top of the stretch. Pretty hard to argue Adair Manor isn't posting another stellar season. I do retain a touch of skepticism about her vis-a-vis the East Coast mares. You mentioned Scylla and Pretty Mischievous. Scylla, she's just starting her stakes career, perhaps not quite a great yardstick of comparison compared to the other East Coast fillies that Adair Manor is going to be facing in the Breeders' Cup Distaff. And Pretty Mischievous has not trained on, obviously, after 3 starts this season, and perhaps she would be a lot more effective these days around 1 turn. So I'm not going to get too excited about Adair Manor having beaten those 2 specific shippers. I'm also a bit skeptical about Adair Manor's record over 9 furlongs. It's been a mixed bag throughout her career. She's won the Santa Margarita twice, but she was 3-10 and 1-20 in those 2 races. And then her 2 losses other 2 losses were at 9 furlongs, were in the Black-Eyed Susan at Pimlico, and then, as you mentioned, the Breeders' Cup Distaff last year against a pretty good field. I'll briefly touch on Ways and Means' win in the Test Stakes on Saturday at Saratoga. An effective win here, taking advantage kind of the track profile that favored speed and close stalking types over a muddy strip. Chad Brown has her doing really good right now, and I think it's smart after having her test 2 turns earlier this season. He's now keeping her basically around 1 turn, aiming for the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint. Race Brown has won the last 2 years with the dual champion Goodnight Olive. We might not get a good gauge in how she stacks up against the better older filly and mare sprinters before the Breeders' Cup, because I don't see many of them running again between the Ballerina at the end of this month and the Breeders' Cup at Del Mar. So I suspect Ways and Means is likely to be given her first shot against older fillies and mares, perhaps in a race like the Gallant Bloom Handicap at Aqueduct in probably sometime in late September. Ashley?
You all covered a lot of points. I pretty much was going to say that neither race was surprising in the outcome, but the trip for Adair Manor was kind of the surprise. She was even fifth at one point and never won in a previous start when she was fifth at some point in a race. So it was good to see her overcoming adversity, because the start was not exactly what we were expecting for Adair Manor. And she also earned a career best 105 brisnet speed figure in this effort, continues to improve. And then Ways and Means, as you mentioned, Vance could go to the filly and mare sprint, and Chad Brown has won the last 2 with Goodnight Olive and 3 overall. So certainly looking like a good runner for that particular race. Well, let's talk about what else caught our eye from the weekend. So Vance, what was that for you?
Well, I thought it was nice to see Notable Speech bounce back strongly last Wednesday in the Sussex Stakes at Goodwood in England. Although the race lost a very prominent horse named Rosalian, so it wasn't quite as strong as a test as it could have been, but as you can see here, Notable Speech sat comfortably behind the odds-on favorite, and then just dove onto his inside with a strong late kick, very reminiscent of the one that he showed at winning the 2,000 guineas at Newmarket. And like I said, this was a very good comeback because he ran a very puzzling non-effort in the St. James's Palace at Royal Ascot in June, race won by Rosalian. And so he's back on his best form going forward. The Sussex was a Breeders' Cup win and you're in for the mile. And he's owned by Godolphin, and Godolphin just seems so totally loaded for bear for the Breeders' Cup mile, especially with the horses they have stabled in the U.S. this summer. We got Master of the Seas and Ottoman Fleet, both of whom are entered in the 4-star Dave handicap this coming Saturday. They also have Naval Power, who is being weighted for the Woodbine Mile in September. So chances are they might not need Notable Speech to actually come to win the Breeders' Cup Mile, but if he does, he really looks like the real deal, and he might wind up being the horse they all have to beat. James?
And they were 1-2 in last year's Breeders' Cup Mile, right?
That's right. Master of the Seas and Maj, yep.
Or Maj, yeah. My what else? I'll mention next. Next went through the motions in Sunday's mile and 5/8 Birdstone Stakes, winning by 22 1/4 lengths. He's a 6-year-old gelding, and while his trainer Doug Cowens initially planned to keep him at longer, like marathon dirt distances all season, he's just outgrown. He's just gotten too good for that competition. And it seems like to me that the Grade 1 Jockey Club Gold Cup on September 2nd is an inevitability for this next start. He's first off, if he didn't go to the Jockey Club, he'd be pointing for a title defense in the Greenwood Cup in September at Parks. And it's fair to question whether any rivals would show up to take a possible 20-length beatdown against Next. He's running 3 races this year. He's much fast. Cowens didn't stretch him out to marathon distances until the end of 2022. He ran in 2 marathon races at the end of that season. He ran in strictly longer distance marathon events last year. And then this year he has 3 starts. And he's clearly much faster and has improved this season than he was last year and as a 4-year-old in 2022. And the fact with Cowan's hesitancy is because he didn't fare well at shorter distances. His cruising speed wasn't as effective going distances less than like a mile and 3/8. And so he didn't run as well at shorter distances earlier in his career. But believe me, those races were a long time ago, and he has completely taken his game to another level. He earned a 109 Brisnet speed rating, winning the Suburban in a mile and 3/8, only an eighth of a mile further than the mile and a quarter Jockey Club Gold Cup 2 starts back. And the reason why I mentioned that Suburban is because the horse that ran second to him today in that race is the only horse this year that has been able to be within 10 lengths of Next. Now, Krupe still got crushed. I mean, he was no factor whatsoever. Next won by like 9.5 lengths, so he completely humbled him. But Krupe came back and finished a rallying second, beating like 2.25 lengths to Arthur's ride in the Whitney. I mean, he is no match for Next. At least at a mile and 3/8. I don't see what would be the difference at a mile and a quarter, yet he's running second in the Whitney. So to me, they got nothing to worry about. He's fast enough to beat any horse in America at a mile and a quarter distance or longer, and the Jockey Club Gold Cup just seems like the logical spot for him because he's going to have a serious chance to win. I also want to mention real quickly on Saturday, Gustavo Delgado, who won the Kentucky Derby 2 years ago with Mage, debuted a first-time starter by Flatter named Ferocious. He broke from the rail in the 8-horse field. He was away dead last. He rushed up, had to wait behind the horse El Prestigio, who you'll see run second here. And then he lost ground going into the far turn. He was a couple lengths back at the top of the stretch. Looked like he was going to get nothing. And then he basically just found a whole nother gear and just blew by the leader to win going away by 8 lengths. He got a 99 Brisnet speed rating, and he's by Flatter with all these stamina influences on his damn side. So that colt has a whole lot going for him. I will caution it wasn't off track, but we saw Ferocious, I think, winning the same not Fierceness, sorry. We saw Fierceness win in the same fashion last year over a wet track at Saratoga, and he carried his form forward, and Ferocious is definitely one to watch for off of that real nice win Saturday, Ashley.
Real quick, too, going back to Next, he is on a 6-win streak now, triple-digit Brisnet speed figures in all 6 of those, and I believe a combined 82 lengths is the margin of victory.
Yeah. His class rating was like 2 points higher than any other horse in America. I mean, figure-wise, they have nothing to worry about going to the Jockey Club Gold Cup, and it should be fun to see it happen.
Yeah, hopefully it happens. I'll take it over to Ellis Park, and on Sunday, Highway Robber won the Turf Cup Preview. It was the finale at Ellis on Sunday. He showed a strong closing kick to win at a mile and a quarter. And what was interesting was he was cross-entered in a stakes on Saturday, was the 7-2 morning line favorite in that stakes race, but Brian Lynch opted for the mile and a quarter instead, where Highway Robber was 12-1 on the morning line, but bet down to 4-1, ended up beating Siege of Boston, the post-time favorite, and stablemate Anglophile finished third with a troubled trip. And now Highway Robber will be in the Grade 2 Turf Cup at Kentucky Downs, coming off a 99 Brisnet speed figure, a career best. If he gets the win in that race, then he'd be in the Breeders' Cup Turf. But of course, the competition gets a little bit tougher there, because then you're going to have the European Invaders from Aidan O'Brien. You're going to have some from Charlie Appleby, some that have been racing here in the U.S. at Saratoga. So I don't know how he'd fare in the Breeders' Cup Turf, but he looked excellent at Ellis Park. I'll say that. That closing kick was very strong. He just ran away with it.
And that race was a good prep for the Turf Cup last year, because Get Smoking, he didn't even win it. He ran fourth, and he came back and won the Turf Cup. But he was a close fourth. He was beat like a half length or something. So he really ran a good race at Ellis and carried his form forward. I thought the horses last year in other races as well ran well back at Kentucky Downs. And so I definitely give Highway Robber and the other winners, I'll definitely give them a look next time.
It was a fun weekend at Ellis, and then there's more stakes action this weekend. Plus, I believe they have wiener dog racing, so definitely check that out as well. But that's all the time we have today for the Racing Roundtable. We'll be back next Tuesday with more stakes recaps, and check out our jury on Thursday with our best bets and fades. We'll see you next time.